So we're looking at the intelligence threats and the risk that they pose to insurance. And I'm joined by an eminent panel here who I will ask to introduce themselves. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Williams-Gardner. I think just been announced, which is great, from FinTech Wales. And obviously Wales is the hub of insurance innovation. Where we've been very lucky to grow that industry significantly. But let me ask my panellists first of all to introduce themselves. Victoria, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go down.
Hello, I'm Victoria Roberts, representing InsurTech UK. We are the trade association for InsurTechs, run by InsurTechs for InsurTechs. So it's a pleasure to be here speaking on the panel today.
And it's fantastic to have you. Chris?
I am Christopher Croft. I am the Chief Executive of the London and International Insurance Brokers Association. We're the trade association for Lloyd's accredited insurance brokers working in the specialty commercial market in London.
Thank you. And Tom?
Good afternoon, I'm Tom Hoad, Head of Howden Ventures. Howden, as you probably know, is one of the world's largest insurance brokers, and I run our corporate venture capital arm. That's basically what I do.
And Lukasz?
Hello, hi, I'm Lukasz Szpruch. I'm a professor of AI at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm director of the Finance and Economics program at the Alan Turing Institute in London.
So I'm sure you'll agree with me, we've got an eminent panel with us here today. Victoria, if you don't mind, I'm going to kick off with yourself. One of the things that we're looking at here is the threats. We've been, as we were talking just before we came on stage, we were talking about partnerships. Can I ask you just to expand on what value you think is going to come out of the partnerships when we talk about how we mitigate threats and how we ensure that we support innovation?
Absolutely. So obviously there will be threats that come from this, but there will be opportunities as well. So we're really seeing partnership working, developing as a really sort of core facet of the UK InsurTech ecosystem. So partnerships obviously have benefits for insurers because I think they're a lot more open these days to not having to do everything in-house and to be partnering to have the latest InsurTech innovations and to be able to adopt and scale those. And obviously that really helps InsurTech innovators to have a market and a customer for their product. We did some research recently as InsurTech UK with McKinsey about the state of the InsurTech sector in the UK, and it was really interesting to see that sort of progression in recent years where about 75% now of the InsurTech sector is a lot more focused on what we would call value chain enablers. So these are people who are much more likely to work in partnership rather than sort of thinking, are we going to be the next Aviva or the next AXA? But it's very much people thinking about where's that specific issue, be it a threat or a new opportunity to deploy AI in the insurance value chain. It's really about people thinking about how they can sort of use their technologies specifically to address those gaps or challenges. So lots of partnership working, something we would really encourage, and we think that is very much the future of how innovations will be adopted across the sector.
Thank you for that. We'll come back to you to talk about some of those specific case studies on partnerships, if you don't mind, in a minute. Chris, can you just pick up on that? Because I think also you feel that this partnerships and the enabler model is something that's going to be really drive the speed of adoption.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's bringing together the expertise in technology and how that can work, but then drawing on insurance expertise to actually fit it to real world problems. And the potential is enormous. I think certainly in the commercial insurance world, the potential to completely revolutionise the risk transfer mechanism through the use of AI and other technologies is significant. We have a lot of clients who don't have a sort of static risk profile throughout the course of a year, and yet we tend to sell them an annual insurance policy. If you own a property in Florida, you have a period of sort of 2 or 3 months where there's quite intense risk if your house blowing down in the wind, and then about 9 months where that's far less of a risk. And with the potential for new technologies to allow us to do continuous risk assessment throughout the year and then trade risk in cleverer ways, and there's a role for technology in developing new financial instruments to allow you to trade risk in that way, then I think you could deliver a totally different and vastly better service to corporate commercial clients. That's only going to happen by bringing in expertise from both technology and insurance and weather modelling and climate risk and all sorts of things to bring those expertise together to develop those solutions.
Thank you very much. And Tom, if I could bring you in, because we were talking about this again as we sort of came down for the panel, and we talk about the partnerships not just in the ways that we can actually mitigate the risk or understand the risk, but working with academics, which will be a nice way to bring Lukasz in sort of after yourself. But how do you see those sorts of partnerships? We talked about brainstorming the art of what might be a risk. Can you just expand on that for me, please?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the heart of all partnerships revolves around human talent and technology. And, if you think about what Lukasz probably does on a day-to-day basis, it's going to be materially different to someone, for example, sitting in an insurance company. So harnessing that and understanding that, plus thinking about, who's motivated most to help solve real commercial problems. So from an InsurTech standpoint, or just a startup standpoint more broadly, entrepreneurs who've given up their day job to pursue changing the world because they've understand a client problem and how to solve it, they're an incredibly powerful force to be working with. So to me, when you work in an organisation like Howden, which has over 25,000 employees, there is an enormous amount of innovation and entrepreneurship happening within the business. But losing sight of what's going on around that and not connecting with the right partners to deliver things for clients is commercially imprudent. So we emphasise that a lot, and our business model is to be very inclusive of cutting-edge technology and talent so that we can create better solutions for our clients.
And so, Lukasz, from the academic perspective and the world that you're in, how do you see that forward look on innovation such that you can bring them to partnerships as Tom's alluding?
Yeah, sure. So I've been leading a number of large partnerships with major financial services industry companies and insurers, and one of the projects that we're currently working on is with AXA Research on developing insurance for AI, and those are kind of topics that you really need to bring expert. AI is moving so fast, this technology is progressing at the pace that even us academics are struggling to keep up. So when we want to build new products that rely on this, we need to kind of anticipate where this technology is heading. So I think that kind of partnerships between organizations that have a good understanding what it means to design the product, what are the kind of constraints that people developing AI technology don't have. You need to bring those communities together. And yeah, there's great stuff is happening when that happens.
And I might just pick up on that actually. Interestingly, I'm not involved in that project with AXA, but I imagine for an insurer, understanding how traditional classes of insurance like professional indemnity, directors and officers insurance, cyber liability now have a new and growing exposure to AI risk, and how the traditional models for underwriting and risk management from an underwriting standpoint, how well do they behave given the new risk paradigm of AI is an important part of that exercise. And by extension, getting a grasp around that so that you can then build out a sustainable set of products and services around AI generally is the right sort of thing to be doing at this point in time. Sorry to jump in, but I think it's an important point.
I want everyone to jump in, because if we can keep the conversation going, I think that's much more helpful.
I just thought it was an interesting example of how fast things progress, that Tom's just referred to cyber liability as a traditional policy.
Oh, very much so now.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, I still try and sell it to government as an emerging risk. So
But that, again, tackling AI in a different way to the way we tackled cyber, I think, that discussion of bringing many people around the table.
Yeah, I can talk to that. I mean, we were chatting before, and it's such a fast-paced emerging topic. It's difficult to sometimes keep up on it. But broadly speaking, organisations need to understand what AI they're using. Now, that seems like an obvious point, but there is such a concept around shadow AI, or AI that is not in the purview of the enterprise architecture and the people that manage risk. So how do you determine what AI you've got and what you haven't got? And then second of all, given the AI that you've got, what is it doing? And is it in compliance? Is it being used in compliance with corporate policy? And then I think the paradigm shift now in this really super emerging risk category is how then does a corporate adopt agentic, which can be commercially transformative, but when you use agentic, you move from a model that is machine learning and broadly understood from a practice standpoint into this sort of new area where the outcomes could be even more unpredictable. So when you move to agentic, what's your framework around the execution pathways? I mean, how does a business actually make commercial decisions? How do you build a framework around identifying with that risk, managing that risk, and then ultimately, is there an insurance product to transfer that risk? And I think it's an amazing area to be in. For me, it feels like when I was involved in the early days of cyber, in the early days of all sorts of different products that I've helped co-create over the years, this really does feel like a new age for insurance. And I think it's something that, this panel and the others in the ecosystem, very, very interested in trying to collaborate on to solve.
I think it's important that we have the conversation now and we get ahead of the issue rather than, to your point, Sarah, what happened with cyber is that it kind of crept up on the industry and we didn't allow for it in traditional policies, and you got to this period where it wasn't entirely clear whether you were covered for cyber incidents or not in your property policy or whatever. And then the natural reaction of the insurers is they discover this problem and their first answer to it is to exclude cyber completely from the policies, and that's just not going to be a commercially viable way forward for the UK economy.
And I think there's how we use AI in our business and how we insure AI. And there's two sides. And I think you were desperate to come in there, Lukasz.
Yeah. So I'm super excited about the role insurance as an industry can play in supporting reliable and safe deployment of AI. Because where we are at the moment, a lot of these AI systems are of assistive nature. So we use them as, help us to do certain things, but they are still humans overviewing decisions. But we are now moving to the systems that are able to take actions. We will have AI assistants booking holidays for us, doing shopping, all that kind of stuff. And there will be material risks and there will be losses. And that risk needs to be managed. That needs to be priced at what insurance industry can do if they get it right. Is to increase standardization around how those systems are being deployed, how risk is being managed, and those that are able to do that will be able to benefit from the insurance. And the trust when it comes to those actions is the key, right? Without trust, this is the biggest bottleneck for those technologies to being rolled out into production at the moment.
And I think when we talk about the trust, we come back to partnership. We come back to sitting around the table, talking quite openly about what we're trying to achieve and how we're doing it. Lukasz and I did have a slight disagreement. I think you can have explainable AI. Lukasz is less sure on that, but we can have that debate. But Victoria, when we're talking about solving these problems and coming back to the partnerships about that transparency, what role is there for people like InsurTech to do to InsurTech UK to create those spaces, and Chris, your organisation, to create those spaces where we can have those open, transparent conversations?
Absolutely, and I think whether it's with potential insurer partners or with regulators, we've heard from the FCA and the Treasury already today, but there's certainly, I think this is a journey that people will collaborate on and go on together. We heard the FCA talking about how their AI live testing lab was about being with people as part of the journey, and I think that's very true, and I think that's a very pragmatic approach, and I think there's a role there for sort of trade associations and academics and people to sort of support those conversations as industry develops. But it was sort of interesting just coming back to your point around the sort of the liability and the accountability. It really echoed some of the conversations we've had on the main stage earlier today. We're sort of talking about e-commerce and agentic AI and where does the liability sit and where's the accountability. And it's always lovely to see lots of people in a room for a panel about insurance, but actually I think that's a great reminder of actually how insurance does play a really critical role in sort of the adoption and the rollout of many of these new technologies that we're talking about across the whole conference, because actually it's sort of allowing that sort of societal risk to be covered. That means we might actually be able to take that next step forward. So,
and I think this is where partnership with the regulator also comes in, doesn't it? And from a personal perspective, 10 years ago we were going down this path from a finance perspective, and we were talking about what sort of protocols, APIs, what standards did we need to put in place so everyone understood the language. maybe insurance now is opening itself up to this market a little bit more, possibly a bit behind the sort of the more of the FinTech piece. Again, I think there's people on the panel who slightly disagree, but insurance is a space that has been less disrupted, I would argue. But please give me some examples of where you think that's not the case, or whether you agree.
Well, I'm itching to jump in on that. I mean, I've been involved in insurance innovation for 21 years, and in that time, I think there's been a paradigm shift in the way that insurers tackle new risks. So if you point at things like InsurTech UK, but you actually look at things like the Lloyd's Lab, where at the heart of the Lloyd's building, there's actually a whole ecosystem around bringing startups in so that people can understand new talent, new technology, and how that might affect the market. If you look at the absolute complete and utter stellar rise in corporates having venture capital type arms and insurance thinking about all the innovations around trying to get people's heads around new risk and how that works. I mean, in my lifetime, I've probably brought 30 plus products to market, and I'm only a small part of the overall ecosystem. So I think it's very much a misnomer that insurance, especially on the B2B, the big corporate stuff, the specialty stuff, is not innovative. It absolutely is. But what we've got to remember is that insurers' balance sheets are really a combination of assets that have predictable outcomes. And when you don't understand a risk and when you can't scale that up, you've got to allocate a lot of capital to it. So in many times, what might be seen as a panacea from the insurance market, if only the insurers would do this, actually the risk is far more complicated than that, and it does need triage down into things that an insurer can understand and therefore allocate capital sufficiently against. But one last thing before I promise to be quiet and let others speak, is that I do think insurers are very good at syndicating risk. This is the idea that they share risk between each other. So when you buy your insurance, often there's much more than one insurer on it. And that ecosystem around starting new product development with many insurers involved is a fascinatingly clever and sustainable way of tackling these issues. So many insurers clubbing together to try and tackle real commercial problems, like we're going to see over the next few years with how insurers step up and tackle AI.
And that's really interesting, because my experience has not gone to that Lloyd's Lab, so maybe there's some other people in the room.
You're not talking to the right broker, I think, and Howden is obviously the right broker. So thank you very much.
Other brokers are available.
Yeah, lots of brokers are available.
Howden, my favourite member at the moment.
But I think, Lukasz, can we just come back on to yourself when you actually think about insuring the tools? Because how are we going to really understand which parts we're insuring, what the tool, because people will use these tools when they have confidence in using them.
So the insurance comes hand in hand with risk management. So you won't be able to provide insurance if you don't have a full control that those systems are reliable, they come with a description, what they're good at, what not they're good at, how they should be used, and you have a way of verifying that they're being used in the right way. So I think that the biggest impact that insurance will have is not just the transfer of risk, but a standardization around how we manage risk of AI. Because at the moment there's a wild west, there's various different initiatives, everyone is trying and exploring, and the reason for that is because the technology is progressing faster than people are able to develop those safety kind of nets and guardrails and all of that. But it's, I think the standardization is the key.
And if I may, sorry, Chris, on that, the trick is not to, a bit like a regulator might be perceived to be, to force standardization on everything. It's to have a set of guiding principles and values to which everyone adopts, so that commercially you can choose which partners from an AI standpoint you want to work with, but you know that the methodology behind it will stand up in terms of how you think about insurance and risk transfer. But I couldn't agree with you more. It's like chicken and egg. You need risk management before you can actually get your insurance policy.
And the risk of bringing a history lesson into a technological discussion, if you look at how society's evolved, that's been the role of insurance at every sort of point of crisis. So the first industrial revolution brought huge improvements to the production process, but the problem was the machines kept catching fire and killing people, and it was the insurance industry that developed the standards for machine construction that stopped that happening. And then industrialization drove urbanization, and you got the growth of big cities, but then you had terrible problems with fires. And if you look at the two big fires in the 1870s in Chicago, where the center of Chicago basically burnt down twice, the insurance industry then developed the building standards that allow people to build houses with proper fire prevention mechanisms. And if you go to Chicago, buildings still display the shield that says that the building complies to those standards back from the 1870s. And then urbanization meant people got left behind, and we developed social insurance in the 20th century to provide for the needy. So insurance, to Victoria's point, is always at the heart of how society and economies progress, and it will be with AI. We just need to find the way to do it.
And it's interesting because we've heard, and I think you just alluding to it, Victoria, we've heard today from many different people. We have a very progressive regulatory system. We have progressive regulators who want to talk to the industry to make sure that they're not curtailing growth or innovation. But I think what I'm picking up here is that maybe the insurance space could be one of the areas that looks at what those guardrails are without blocking them. So what do we think, what sort of actions do maybe the InsurTechs, the large insurance partners, what do they need to do to start bringing more people on this journey with them? Because it seems as though this industry is quite open to the risks of the tools, but also the risks of mitigation that need to be approached. So Victoria, are you comfortable to come in on that?
I'd probably just say the collaboration again. I think
Okay.
the fact that we so frequently can have the incumbents, the InsurTechs, the regulators all in the room is really important. One of the examples I was actually thinking about as you were talking about the sort of societal developments was autonomous vehicles. That will be the next, won't it, where there's a real sort of overlap there between the technology, the AI, the underwriting of the risk, but then also where that liability actually sits in terms of the manufacturer or the sort of owner of the car or the insurer. So certainly for me that's like one area where I think a lot of these collaborative conversations will no doubt need to continue to progress.
So before we go into autonomous vehicles and where the insurance liabilities lie, which is huge and it's a big area in its own right, I have been told we have to wrap up. I can't quite believe the time has gone so quickly. But very quickly from each one of you, this time next year, what would you like to see to show that progression has been made?
Well, I would like to see a market for insurance of AI in existence.
I think it's an ecosystem shift with multiple partners coming together to tackle the problem. And then to Lukasz's point, I can't see a world where insurers will not be providing some form of AI coverage in some way, shape or form.
Okay.
And then I think to Lukasz's point, by this time next year we need to have a much firmer grip on what are going to be the building standards of AI that will allow insurance to play its part.
I'd just say more generally, more fantastic UK grown and based InsurTechs that are providing a lot of these AI solutions into the insurance industry to help business and consumers prepare for the future.
Well, let me take the opportunity to thank everybody. I think one thing is for sure, we have a very innovative sector and a sector that is open to what we need to tackle. So I'm confident we'll come back this time next year and we'll have progressed significantly. So thank you very much, Lukasz, Tom, Chris and Victoria. Thank you very much for joining me and
Thank
for
you.
the audience
Thank
for
you.
joining us. Thank you.